Welcome to week 2 of our Yahoo Q&A here together on a Friday. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle of Establish the Run. And as I like to do, as your questions begin filtering in throughout this chat, I like to begin with what happened on Thursday night and if there were any takeaways. And in particular, last night between the Commanders and Packers, I do think there are two important things we should start with the top of the show discussing. And let's open up with Austin Ekeler's torn ACL and injury out for the rest of the year. The obvious answer is that it opens the door for Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. But let's talk about why and how vast now this opportunity projects to become for JCM, Bill himself. And that is because so far, Austin Ekeler has had that coveted receiving role that allows running backs to reach their ceilings. Remember, especially in PPR leagues, a target is actually worth 1.5 points, and carries are worth a point. We always want our running backs in fantasy football to get targets. That's how they reach their ceiling. And now with Austin Ekeler, who's led their backfield and routes in each of the first 2 games, not only that, but to also be in front of Bill Krosky-Merritt and Jeremy McNichols in catches, as neither Krosky-Merritt or McNichols has a single catch on the year so far. For Ekeler to still have that role, 2 catches even last night by the time he got injured, but now it get taken away, it's at least up for grabs. And we want to bet when we're looking at a mystery box, when we're looking at 2 doors we could possibly open, but only keep one of the gifts. We at least want to bet on the unknown as opposed to a player like Jeremy McNichols, who has not only not reached 46 carries in any season since he's been in the league since 2017, but also a player who's never topped 38 catches. Not someone we're really worried about ever growing into a full-time role. So we definitely want to bet on the unknown upside of Bill Krosky-Merritt moving forward now without Austin Ekeler. And although Krosky-Merritt didn't have a receiving profile through 5 years in college, topped out with just 13 catches in any season. It doesn't matter because, again, we do not believe with Ekeler now out, they have that player on their team that can step into that role. It takes a little bit of wish casting, but I still believe we should simply cross our fingers and just bet on the unknown ceiling that we have not seen, which leads us to push Bill Krosky-Merritt up the rankings for the rest of the season, so much so that I believe he could be a top 24 running back the rest of the way, with only McNichols standing in his path. The other big fallout on Thursday night was another letdown performance from Matthew Golden. And we know that veterans get the deference typically in the first month of the season. It's historically always been that way for fantasy football. And the performances that we can point to, whether it be Brock Bowers, Sam Laporta, Tyler Warren in week 1, Tyler Warren, who actually recorded the highest target share for a rookie tight end in their first game ever in NFL history. We can point to those and remember those because they're outliers. They're anomaly performances. Whereas usually rookies go the path of Colston Loveland, Luther Burden, or Matthew Golden. The Packers historically have always rotated their wide receivers. This was always a discussion when drafting one of them or looking at their ADPs, and Matthew Golden was going first off the board. The issue for Matthew Golden so far, not only just 2 targets in each of his first 2 games in the NFL, but just an 8.1% target share. And the concerning part of all of that is that he also struggled to earn targets in college. That was the knock and the worry coming into the NFL is, can this individual actually become an alpha, a target earner on his own team, since he was not capable of doing so in any stint in his 3 seasons of college, given that he never had a 16% target share in any season. And now we're looking at what Matthew Golden is through 2 games. And I think the public consensus is that he's a couple catches away, right? He's a couple good throws away from Jordan Love from having 100 yards and a touchdown last night. But the results are not what we should be looking at. We're following the process here to get to the right results. And even if Matthew Golden had 100 yards and a touchdown last night, he would have been a sell high candidate because, again, it is still just an 8.1% target share through 2 games. Last night even, just a 5.5% target share. Whenever it's that low of earning your team's targets and also your targets are coming 15 plus yards downfield, that's how you become Chase Claypool, a player we can't start in fantasy football or couldn't start whenever he played. What we do need is someone like Rome Odunze, who not only comes out in week 1 in Ben Johnson's offense and leads the Bears in depth of target, but also leads the Bears in targets. We want that ceiling depth of target combined with ceiling opportunity, not what's happening with Matthew Golden. Now that you're aware of who Matthew Golden was coming out of college anyhow, and only got boosted into the first round because he ran a fast 40 time, let's zoom out and understand that Jayden Reed's absence for the next 6 to 8 games, most likely more, 1, makes Reed droppable, but 2, opens the door for Matthew Golden to get more opportunity. And that's where we're at now, is that most likely Matthew Golden may still struggle to earn targets, but at least we are plucking Jayden Reed out from this offense entirely and giving more opportunity to the only 3 wide receivers they play consistently in Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks, and Golden. On waiver wires in week 2 at Establish the Run, I will definitely be writing in Doubs and Wicks as players we should pick up. But it doesn't hurt to put some feelers out there for Matthew Golden now that we are not expecting Jayden Reed to join the Packers again until late into the year. A few more takeaways from week 2 before we dive into the chat for your questions. Ahead of week 2, I should say. And that is 1, I discussed this last week, so I quickly want to hit on it again now that Dallas Goedert has already been ruled out for the Eagles. And that is, I still believe A.J. Brown is one of the best buy lows in fantasy football. The hamstring injury nagged him, yes, but he still tied Devonta Smith quietly in week 1 for the most routes run for the Eagles. And A.J. Brown came out afterwards and even mentioned that the Cowboys just, quote, zoned him to death. The Cowboys didn't play a single snap for man defense in that game, which obviously then pockets A.J. Brown into limited windows, and that allowed Dak Prescott to instead, that allowed the Eagles and Jalen Hurts, I should say, to instead pepper Dallas Goedert underneath rather than forcing a big play. Not every defense is going to play as psychotic as Matt Eberflus with 100% of their snaps from zone. I do think it was an anomaly performance. And remember, that 5% target share, that single target that A.J. Brown had in week 1 that everyone's concerned about, that was also his lowest target share in any full game for Philadelphia in his career so far. We are still close enough to week 1 that we are leaning into our priors in the offseason. I hate when people say the season's begun now, so I don't care where I draft players. I disagree, because we have 16 more games compared to 6 months of work we put into a full season and understanding regression, schedule analysis, the list goes on. Some things have changed, like the 49ers for the next month, for example, with Mac Jones. Some things we should alter in our opinions. But throwing them out entirely just because one game has happened, I disagree with entirely. And so I am still leaning into my priors with what the Eagles offense will be. And what that is their first 2 seasons with A.J. Brown, 31 and 33 pass attempts per game. Last year, 24 pass attempts per game. Not only the fewest in the league last year, but the 4th fewest in the last decade. given what they showed us, how they wanted to play with A.J. Brown in the first 2 seasons with him, I believe that 24 from last year and the few attempts we saw in week 1 from them is still unsustainable numbers, and it only goes up from here. Thus, I want to be ahead of what I believe will be A.J. Brown's worst opportunity he sees all season with that single target, and I want to buy low. On the other hand, with every buy low comes a sell high. And right now, I believe Travis Etienne is a player to sell extremely high. First off, when we talk about how rookies are usually coddled out the gates, I do think this is an amazing short-term window. This 1-week game for Travis Etienne coming off a career high, 146 rushing yards, 19 touches, and I bet he might even see more than those 19 touches, given that we're not expecting Bashal Tutin, the next man up, to suddenly get the same, not only amount of touches that Tank Bigsby had in week 1, but to be used significantly. Given that LaQuint Allen, their day 3 rookie, was also used on passing downs, and that was LaQuint Allen's profile coming out of college, a double-digit target share in each of his last 2 seasons at Syracuse. So against the Bengals, that I don't, when stepping out and thinking about what teams were this offseason, I don't think the Browns struggled to run the ball because the Bengals are suddenly good at run defense. I don't think that at all. I think it was the Browns' running backs and rushing attack that will struggle every week. And that's why Dylan Sampson's longest run was 5 yards, not because they played the Bengals. And now we get to see this intuitive Liam Cohen offense with Travis Etienne continuing to handle the lion's share of touches. So why, you ask, are we then selling Travis Etienne high? And that's simple, because we're looking ahead at the schedule for the next month after this Bengals game when we believe we can sell Etienne high. And that is the Jaguars then going on to play the Texans, the 49ers, who we don't even look at their advanced stats, their EPA per play, their success rate last year, given how banged up they were. And now that they have multiple rookies starting, and what is, as they even showed in week 1, a better defense with Robert Saleh. And I imagine those young players and new faces in Robert Saleh's defense will continue to get even better as they learn the scheme and get comfortable with every passing week. The Chiefs run defense after that for Etienne, who, reminder, in the last calendar year, the Chiefs have only allowed one running back in the regular season to rush for over 80 yards. That was Jerome Ford last year, and he only did that because he had a 62-yard run in the game. Otherwise, even Amarian Hampton has struggled mightily against Steve Spagnuolo's run defense. The Seahawks defense after that, which many consider to be one of the most elite in the league, and then the Rams. And by that time, given that Bashal Tutin is projected for the Bucky Irving role, the role that did not even come to fruition for Bucky Irving until the second half of the season, given all of that, you can then ask if Etienne were to struggle against that murderous row of a schedule, then probably Tutin comes in afterwards. So it seems like we have the next 10 days to sell Etienne. Otherwise, we are stuck with him. And based on what I just mentioned, I do not think that's a player we want to be stuck with, especially after he stands out with an anomaly career high in rushing yards in week 1. With that being said, those are my quick thoughts heading into week 2, and we can get to your questions. Beginning with Tiger Uppercut suggests he needs to sit one between Jacoby Myers, who we never sit. Jacoby Myers now, going back to last year, in the full games he's overlapped with Brock Bowers since Devontae Adams was traded, Jacoby Myers has a higher target share than Brock Bowers. He has earned targets at a higher rate than Bowers without Devontae Adams. We do not sit Jacoby Myers ever. So Jacoby Myers, who was one of the biggest steals in PPR leagues, we were starting him. The other three, Jameson Williams, George Pickens, DJ Moore. What was interesting about the first iteration, the first game we saw under Ben Johnson for the Bears, is that all the hype about DJ Moore playing in the backfield did come true. That actually did happen. And it is now a game indoors against Detroit's secondary that has also lost pieces in week one. We were also happy. I know the result was the most Bears thing we've all ever seen, but we were all happy that at least the first 20 to 25 scripted plays from Ben Johnson worked great. Caleb Williams at the end of the day still finished with his second most rushing yards of his career and his first rushing touchdown in the NFL. The downfield throws that he struggled with last year, that was the concern. And we are hoping, similar to how Liam Cohen corralled Trevor Lawrence in and chopping Lawrence's depth of target a full 2.2 yards, 7 air yards per attempt for Trevor Lawrence, as opposed to launching the ball downfield at 9.8 last season, which led to many inaccurate targets because Trevor Lawrence for his entire career has struggled throwing the ball downfield. So he should not be throwing downfield often. Liam Cohen made that easier for him. But for Caleb Williams, it was not shocking for me to go into our friends at Fantasy Points data and see that out of 32 quarterbacks in week one, Caleb Williams was actually 31st in uncatchable pass rate. That's who he was last year. But again, we like the scripted plays so much, and we still, going back to our offseason analysis and the resume we have, trust Ben Johnson, that we think he'll corral Caleb Williams in and make life easier, give him a higher completion rate, build his confidence, and then we can take those shots downfield. So when we're talking about these three individuals, because it's so close, as I mentioned last week, I usually tend to lean into game script. And I still have enough confidence in the game script indoors between the Bears and Lions that I will bench George Pickens against the Giants, who we saw nothing good from. Even their front seven, which is supposed to be one of the best units in the league, struggled mightily to stop the run, which is why Javonte Williams is also in another amazing spot this week. I'll sit George Pickens in that game between these options. Matthew Perzepiora asks Dak Prescott or Justin Fields. And for me, even last week, when everyone mentioned Justin Fields or Trevor Lawrence was the big one, I believe was the question we got the most. I kept on saying it's quite easily Justin Fields because you take the rushing floor. This is a 6-point passing touchdown league. And Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, Michael Penix, the pocket passers, even though Penix coming off a career-high 6 carries. So we may not even be able to call him a pocket passer anymore. But the pocket passers, that's how they can combat the Konami code rushing quarterbacks that sneak into the top 12 is because of the 6-point touchdown scoring. Having said that, I'm still taking the rushing floor of Justin Fields pretty easily, honestly. Justin Fields also in a fun matchup where we may not get many plays, but I talked about the promise we saw from Liam Cohen in his first game of play calling, unlike John Morton for the Lions, unlike Nick Caley for the Texans, which was an abysmal first showing in play calling, and Josh Grizzard for the Bucks. Maybe we'll get to Baker Mayfield in a bit. But those three play callers, absolutely concerned about, and we should be upset at moving forward. But Liam Cohen, and to this point, Tanner Engstrom for the Jets, who threw a lot of different looks at the Steelers last week with Justin Fields, with Breece Hall. We have a lot of promise for Tanner Engstrom so far, and it's quite easy to continue leaning into Justin Fields as a top 12 quarterback. Raven Terp, who would also listen to me, not only at EstablishTheRun.com nowadays, But when I came up with Evan Silva and Adam Levitan at RotoWorld, and he asked for full PPR, need one tight end and one flex, and that is between Juwan Johnson, Kyle Pitts, Isaiah Pacheco, and Kayshon Boutte. And it is quite easily for me, Juwan Johnson and Kayshon Boutte. I want to be clear, not only was Juwan Johnson the tight end 1 overall in week 1, but he was also the tight end 1 in expected fantasy points, which suggest opportunity. Even if a player doesn't score number 1 in fantasy points, expected fantasy points shows us what they received in terms of volume and opportunity. And Juwan Johnson, a route on 96% of the Saints dropbacks. Not only that, but a 26.5% target share. And remember, in Dallas Goedert's 12 full games with Kellen Moore last year, Kellen Moore, who has historically been a tight end kingmaker, even elevated Dalton Schultz to get a big deal with the Texans in free agency in past years when they overlap with the Cowboys. Dallas Goedert, in those 12 full games under Kellen Moore with the Eagles last season, the 6th highest target share at his position. This is what Kellen Moore does, is elevate tight ends. And Juwan Johnson was part of that with the best usage of any tight end in the entire league in week 1. Not only that, but we saw, again, going back to having confidence in new players, playmakers, and play callers moving forward, Cohen, Engstrand, and Kellen Moore. Kellen Moore, who even with Spencer Rattler, let it rip for a league-high 46 pass attempts, tying Josh Allen and Drake May, and the highest pass rate from neutral game script. Everyone, all the nerds like myself, look at neutral game script in a different manner. They all have a different reason for it. For me personally, my parameters are within 6 points, so within 1 score, and not in the 2-minute drill, since most teams are always passing in the 2-minute drill. But just letting you know, after 1 game, very small sample, whenever it was in 1 score, Kellen Moore was throwing the ball. And I think that's what his offense is going to be. Juwan Johnson, no competition either at his position, given that Jack Stoll only ran 5 routes, was waived to the practice squad, and only promoted again midweek because the Saints don't have a backup tight end. So although the 49ers are a team we typically don't like to play tight ends against in fantasy because Fred Warner is an absolute beast and single-handedly shutting them down, Juwan Johnson is quite easily a arguable tight end 1 moving forward and someone I'm absolutely not benching. The other one, Kayshon Boutte, is quite Boutte. One of those pronunciations is also easy, given that we got the same run out except with the results that we got last year. And now in 3 of Boutte's last 4 games, he has at least 95 yards and or a touchdown. And in the 10 full games he overlapped with Drake May last year, led them in depth of target as their downfield explosive receiver. Except this time, not only leading the Patriots and depth of target again as an explosive receiver, but unlike Matthew Golden, as we talked about at the top of the show, earns targets and tying Hunter Henry for a team-high 18% target share. We just saw what the Dolphins allowed to Daniel Jones of all quarterbacks. So yes, we imagine that Drake May and Kayshon Boutte are bouncing back in a very big way in week 2. Whereas we cannot trust Kyle Pitts now that Drake London and Darnell Mooney have been confirmed in and playing against the Vikings. And Isaiah Pacheco is not a player we're excited to start anyhow, given that we are going his last 9 games, playoffs included. I understand he was coming back from a broken leg. But remember, we talked about this last week, where Pacheco had a range of outcomes that we should expect anywhere from a low-end RB2 to a player we bench because he's nothing more than a matchup-based flex. And the run-out we got in week 1 and tying Kareem Hunt in carries and also not having the touch equity inside the 5-yard line as Kansas City's goal back, that's a very easily benchable player. So we are not starting Isaiah Pacheco. Jelly of the Month asked, Harold Fannin or Hunter Henry, and I think it's quite easily Harold Fannin, because when you get into that range for Harold Fannin, where we talked about the two doors, we're opening one, looking into the other, but the two doors we look at for the mystery result, whenever they're that close, whenever they are Harold Fannin and Hunter Henry, we go with the unknown ceiling in Harold Fannin every time. I would be shocked personally. I'd be shocked if Harold Fannin was a tight end one the rest of the way. I know that's probably not what you're hearing from public consensus. That's fine. I've been wrong before. This is not my job to just agree with public consensus. I do the work and research on my own and go through my own process. I think the most reasonable outcome for Harold Fannin is to be Isaiah Likely to Mark Andrews, who in this case is in David Njoku. You do have the dangling carrot and Harold Fannin having an out that David Njoku on the last year of his contract could get traded at the trade deadline. But also for a player to reach their ceiling and bet on his teammate getting traded, that's not part of the process I want to bake in. It's exciting, awesome, that Harold Fannin led his own team in targets. That's the kind of player he was in college as well, and we should be excited to roster and start that, which is why he should definitely easily be started over Hunter Henry. But in terms of Harold Fannin ROS, again, I would be shocked if he was a tight end one the rest of the way, all things considered, given that it is a vast target tree, unlike tighter target trees, right? Like Juwan Johnson, that is only Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and Juwan Johnson. The Browns have 4 players, 5 if you want to add in Dylan Sampson, and Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, David Njoku, Harold Fannin, and Dylan Sampson. Not to mention worst quarterback play in Joe Flacco, who we're all expecting to get benched for a rookie at some point because the Browns offense is bad. So that is my personal view on Harold Fannin. Quite easily starting, though, over Hunter Henry, because that's not the firewall that I'm interested in benching Harold Fannin for. PPR, start 2, Alvin Kamara, Ken Walker, Nick Chubb, RJ Harvey, and or Dylan Sampson. And with Quinshon Judkins practicing in full, getting listed as questionable, most likely to start, I think I'm getting off Dylan Sampson this week personally, just because we think he'll have the pass catching role that he had last week, but he was nearly doubled up. Oh, no, not nearly. He was doubled up in routes by Jerome Ford, who, just because Dylan Sampson earned 8 targets, you would think that naturally means he will have the pass catching role over Quinshon Judkins, who was not a pass catcher at all at Ohio State. But we don't know. That's still up for interpretation because Jerome Ford still led that backfield in routes run. Maybe that's the role they want Jerome Ford to have, despite not having the ability to earn targets in front of Dylan Sampson. So I cannot start Dylan Sampson if Quinshon Judkins is playing. And what we saw from Ken Walker in a timeshare with Zach Charbonnet is enough for me to say there at least is no one right now for Nick Chubb coming for that role. So I will take Alvin Kamara and Nick Chubb over Walker, Harvey, and Sampson. Harvey's still a player I'm very interested in, but I don't think it's shocking that we got Tyler Bidet involved on passing downs, a 16% target share in week 1. Remember, not only does Sean Payton always play every guy, this is always the case, except for Cortland Sutton, who ran around on every drop back, and Sutton has now earned 23% of Denver's targets in 11 of his last 12 games. Sean Payton always plays every guy. That's not surprising. But Tyler Bidet is someone he really does like. Rewind to Week 3 last year, whenever Bidet tied for a team high share of touches with Javonte Williams out of nowhere, and then was trending towards being the lead running back for the Broncos, a team that drafted Audric Estime in the 4th round last year. So they had a rookie with somewhat relevant capital. Drafted Audric Estime, still let Tyler Bidet be the starting running back, but then on his way to leading the team in touches as a whole over Javonte, suffered that serious neck and back injury, got stretchered off the field. We didn't see him again. He comes back in week 1, and he's their pass catching back again with 16 routes or with a 16% target share. So Bidet, I do think, is here to stay in a 3-headed timeshare with J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey. But we also saw R.J. Harvey have that 50-yard run because that's what he can do. So right now, Harvey is a tough start in a 3-headed committee, but someone I still absolutely want to keep on the roster. Need 2 flexes in non-PPR between a lot of players. So let's cut to the chase here, because Jay McLaughlin is asking the relevant players: Jordan Mason, George Pickens, Keenan Allen, Zach Charbonnet, Quentin Johnston. And the Chargers game is an interesting one because we got the opposite run out of what I thought we were going to get from the Chargers offense. And the month before their bye, they're one of the run heaviest teams in the entire league. But in week 1 on Friday night, they led the entire league with a 16.5% pass rate over expectation. They even had that situation where they were at their own 1-yard line, and rather than running the ball in that game against the Chiefs on Friday night to create more room, Jim Harbaugh let it rip instead as Justin Herbert just dropped back to pass the ball instead. It was a very exciting game for the Chargers offense. And Justin Herbert is clearly amazing. I do think it's still fair to question, though, and I do hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong here. I think it's fair to question if that's who the Chargers want to be this year, or do they still want to be the same offense we've historically seen at every stop from Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh in a run-heavy one? At least we still have the question in week 2. But if they do go the route of leaning to Justin Herbert, everyone's going to succeed because Justin Herbert is, as he showed, that incredible at football. So we don't know. There's a lot of questions here, but at least we saw Keenan Allen lead in targets in that great matchup, as we talked about last week, one that we knew to start Keenan Allen, given that the Chiefs allowed the most fantasy points and catches per game to opposing slot receivers in 2024. I will bank on this game script for Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston and start them over the group of other players. Jelly of the Month asked, Trevor Lawrence or Bo Nix? And after that performance in week 1, Bo Nix is not necessarily someone I'm excited to start until I see more. Bo Nix, remember, over the second half of the season, did better, arguably because the schedule got that much softer. He also stopped running consistently, which was always a concern. But in week 1, we at least got 8 carries from him. That's good. But the analysis of Bo Nix in overdrafting Bo Nix, who was one of the worst picks in fantasy football this year. In 2024 offseason, Bo Nix was left for dead, even though he was quite easily projectable as a 17-game starter. But this offseason, he was being drafted as a top 10 quarterback. And that's not the kind of price we're playing like a quarterback for Bo Nix, who, again, when you were weighing both outcomes, you could poke holes and say, I think it was better because the schedule got easier in the second half, especially since he showed up to the playoff game, was the same Bo Nix we saw in the first 8 games. So I'm still very much worried about Bo Nix. I think we could be looking at him being droppable, or just a streamer-based rushing quarterback moving forward. So I think it's quite easily Trevor Lawrence, again, against the soft Bengals defense. Joe Flacco, if you account for batted passes and drop balls, which even one of Joe Flacco's interceptions was Jerry Jeudy dropping a ball off his hands and going into a defender's arms. If you account for the drops and batted passes, Joe Flacco actually completed 85.5% of his passes, which was the fourth highest rate in the league. It's not as if the Bengals defense got better after adding no one. They just happened to play the Browns offense. So we think Trevor Lawrence, and again, what we saw from Lee and Cohen in week 1, we definitely think it's going to be able to succeed with ease against the Bengals in week 2. So quite easily, Trevor Lawrence over Bo Nix for me. PPR, Devonta Smith or Jameson Williams. And I like the situation for Devonta Smith enough to start him over Jameson Williams. It's not only that Devonta Smith has been extremely successful in these matchups in the past against the Chiefs, who have become rivals, but we look at the 162 plays last year where A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith were on the field without Dallas Goedert, since Dallas Goedert has now been ruled out for week 2. And in those games, Devonta Smith had an increased 25% target share. It's not as if Grant Calcaterra and Jahan Dotson suddenly step up and earn targets. Those guys can't earn targets. I know Dotson had the big catch in week 1, but that's the run out. It's not as if he shows up suddenly and gets a 20% target share. The targets without Dallas Goedert only get more condensed to AJB and Devonta Smith. So I'm starting Devonta Smith. Same thing here. JB Like says Devonta Smith or Ted McMillan, and I am also going Devonta Smith once again, given the condensed target tree and given the injuries for the Panthers on their offensive line. I think that's also why Bryce Young looked like a pumpkin again. Because whenever Bryce Young came back and started in place of Andy Dalton, who had the car wreck and then got benched, couldn't make a start, then they start building into Bryce Young. Remember, Bryce Young was still a below-average quarterback. I know he was hyped up as being good all of a sudden. He performed poorly. He just performed above average relative to Bryce Young in the past. And that's not the scale we're looking at. Good Bryce Young or bad Bryce Young. Bryce Young was still a below-average quarterback when he returned and started last year. What we liked in the offseason in drafting him in Superflex leagues was that he at least averaged 5.2 rushing points over those last starts. We like that little boost. That's why Bo Nix was drafted, for that little rushing boost in undraftable territory. But Bryce Young through the air, unfortunately, became rookie year Bryce Young in week 1. And now he gets, once again, a tough matchup against this Jonathan Gannon zoned out defense, who the Saints still move the ball well against indoors. But when we're looking at the market and what Vegas predicts this game to do as a whole, since Vegas is clearly much more accurate than us with our takes, this total continues to decrease because we expect it to be a slower moving one that James Conner is going to dominate. So I like when we are nitpicking top 24 wide receivers, I personally am starting Devonta Smith over Ted McMillan. Panda Moose asks, drop Ollie Gordon for Cam Skattebo, and that's fine. I think Cam Skattebo offers more return sooner than Ollie Gordon, since Ollie Gordon likely does not offer anything as long as Devon Achane is healthy. But Ollie Gordon has more of a ceiling if an injury were to happen to a player in front of them. Like if Devin Singletary or Tyrone Tracy were injured, one of those two, the other one who's healthy, is still probably involved with Cam Skattebo. Whereas if Achane is injured, the Dolphins literally only have 2 running backs on their active roster. Ollie Gordon would get every touch. So it just depends what you're looking for. If you're needing to start a running back in the next 6-7 weeks, the answer is Cam Scatterboo. If you're only looking for ceiling and a stash that could provide a 0, but give you 20 plus touches if the player ahead of him were injured for any reason, then you pick up Ollie Gordon instead, or keep Ollie Gordon. Timothy asked Trevor Lawrence or Justin Fields. It's Justin Fields for all the reasons we mentioned. We're not worried about benching Justin Fields. We're not going to get too cute here. No need to overthink that. Choose two people in PPR, Ted McMillan, Ricky Pearsall, or Devonta Smith. And this one is easy for me, not only just because we said Devonta Smith over Ted McMillan, but also we're absolutely not benching Ricky Pearsall. Remember that Mac Jones last year in his 6 starts for the Jaguars, not only a top 24 quarterback in 4 of them, but a top 10 quarterback in 2 of them. And elevated Brian Thomas. Let's not say elevate. Assisted Brian Thomas to becoming the wide receiver 1 in fantasy over Jamar Chase in their last 4 games together. Ricky Pearsall in a more condensed target tree without George Kittle for the next month, with only Christian McCaffrey as the only other player who can earn targets in that team. Ricky Pearsall is going to the moon. We are not benching Ricky Pearsall from Mac Jones, who I actually think is also a good super flex starter this week, given the results I mentioned from last year in a much worse environment and coaching staff in Jacksonville. But also, Kyle Shanahan's system is one built for Mac Jones. A first read type play calling scheme where Mac Jones doesn't have to do much, but find his first read and allow that guy to get upfield. And that guy will be Ricky Pearsall. Panda Moose asked, is Chris Godwin worth stashing or drop for Quentin Johnston? So Chris Godwin, it got reported, returned to practice on Monday, I believe, or maybe will return to practice. But still the earliest outlook is week 5. But even then, you have to factor in the ramp-up time. So we're talking about another couple weeks, because obviously you would never start Godwin in his first game. You never would. You would cross your fingers, hope he goes off on your bench. You would never start him, though. So, is Chris Godwin worth stashing? Yes, on your IR. Over someone like Quentin Johnston. Now, if you are very weak at wide receiver, like you are actually starting Quentin Johnston, I probably keep him, given that QJ does have that outcome where the Chargers want to pass the ball more. And so we're wrong on QJ's outlook for the rest of the season. And he does suddenly have a ceiling with Keenan Allen and Ladd McConkey. Otherwise, if you're not using Quentin Johnston, you drop him and stash Chris Godwin instead. Eric Ostberg asks that he's been offered Aaron Jones and Caleb Johnson for Keon Coleman. And he's curious about my long-term thoughts on these players. So he quickly mentions at the end of that, Isaiah Pacheco for Keon Coleman. I'd much rather have Keon Coleman over Isaiah Pacheco. Much, much rather. For the running backs situation, though, because that's what it is, right? If you accept this trade, it's going to differ entirely based on what you need. If you need a wide receiver, you go the Keon Coleman route. If you need a running back and Keon Coleman, he's your wide receiver 4 or 5, who you have start-sit questions about every week, you just take Aaron Jones. And that's what makes it hard. But in terms of who has the higher ceiling, Keon Coleman had 65 yards and a touchdown in the 4th quarter. But he is still a second-year player developing with Josh Allen and the only X receiver, the only big-bodied guy they can put in man coverage on the Bills from Josh Allen. So it's still just a profile that despite I'm not going to say poor, but questionable rookie year, despite all of that, it's just a profile we hold our nose and bet on because that's the kind of players we bet on. So I'm still saying Keon Coleman over Aaron Jones, basically. But again, if you were a team where Keon Coleman's your wide receiver 4 or 5, which is probably what this deal is happening, you can also take Aaron Jones as an RB3 weekly because you need that position instead of Keon Coleman. It's a fair trade. The Caleb Johnson wrench is a little more unique because when and if the runout ever happens, we quite literally can't pinpoint. I have no idea. Is Caleb Johnson going to go the Tank Bigsby route of a rookie season like he started in week 1 where he had 1 touch and it went for -2 yards? I definitely don't think so. Again, just assume veteran deference every first month of the season and appreciate the outlier performances for rookies that happen. But it's obviously possible that Caleb Johnson, with day 2 draft capital, can break out in the second half of the season, especially because a guy like Kenneth Gainwell, who led them in targets, their running backs anyways, in targets, especially because Kenneth Gainwell for his entire career has never been a guy who stuck around for a long role. Jaylen Warren has, even though Jaylen Warren has never been given an every down role. Jaylen Warren's never gone away as a satellite back. Kenneth Gainwell has even lost that role in the past. So it's obviously possible Caleb Johnson breaks out in the second half of the season. When and if that happens, though, especially after week 1, mightily unclear. So it ultimately comes down to, do you need a wide receiver or do you need a running back? Reese Fletcher, I'm not sure which pronunciation, asks, drop Purdy for J.J. McCarthy, and that's totally fine given that it looks like 2 to 4 weeks that you won't have Brock Purdy. It's that simple. Kyle Siebert asks, trade Pickens, Troy Franklin in a 3rd, so we're assuming this is dynasty, for A.J. Brown and a 6th. And yes, I would do that. I would want the A.J. Brown, who is still the fringe first-round player, and a 6th rounder over the combination of Pickens, Franklin, and 3rd, assuming that Troy Franklin only ran the 2nd most routes for the Broncos because it was Sean Payton. If Marvin Mims now or Pat Bryant popped up as the 2nd wide receiver for Denver in week 2, it would not be shocking. I got, pick 2. I'm not going to say the other ones. Mike Evans, Emeka Egbuka, Ricky Pearsall, Kayshon Boutte. I think for me it would be Ricky Pearsall and Mike Evans. Even though we are probably getting Derek Stingley shadow coverage. I can't bitch Ricky Pearsall. Can't. And so it then becomes between Mike Evans and Egbuka. And, I mean, honestly, I feel lucky that what we got out of Emeka Egbuka in that game, the 2 long touchdowns after still ceding 2 targets. Mike Evans led the team with a 26.5% target share. Emeka Egbuka, as many as Sterling Shepard, he just burst upfield for 2 touchdowns, which he can do. But Evans is still the guy who earns targets over him. So for me, it would be Mike Evans and Ricky Pearsall. Also, at some point, we're expecting the bottom to fall out for the Bucs offense, for Baker Mayfield in particular. Right now, and last season, given his career-high touchdown rate and fantasy points per game, right now, Baker Mayfield is the Jesse Pinkman meme, and he can't possibly keep getting away with it. This week, for example, 25th in yards per attempt, 30th at completion rate, but 4th in touchdown rate. So, inaccurate, inefficient, but threw for touchdowns. That's not a recipe for success. I think Baker Mayfield is someone to quite easily sell high on in Superflex leagues. I guarantee you he would garner more in that type of format because at some point the bottom's going to fall out here despite all the talent around him. Henry Odom asks, need two: Tony Pollard, Amarian Hampton, Kenneth Walker, Aaron Jones, Jordan Mason. And for me, it is Tony Pollard and Amarian Hampton, given that those are the only two out of these three that are not in timeshares, and the other three are. But you got a bunch of RB2 threes here. Con Case, lots of Devonta Smith questions, asked Devonta Smith or Emeka Egbuka. I think in that case, I go Emeka Egbuka. So that would mean I have in my rankings Mike Evans, Emeka Egbuka, Devonta Smith, Ted McMillan. That sounds right. So yeah, I would go Egbuka over Devonta Smith. Let's see here. Questions that we haven't got to. Lots of Kyle Pitts question again. I don't want to start Kyle Pitts at all, given that Drake London and Darnell Mooney are back. Last week, obviously, not only Darnell Mooney out of the game, but Drake London gets injured, battles that shoulder injury. So Kyle Pitts is not someone, given his career resume, that I'm excited to start at all. I'd much rather start Jake Ferguson in a condensed target tree, because for the Cowboys, it is only CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens, and Jake Ferguson. Alec Hernandez mentions Breece Hall or T. Higgins. I think it's quite easily Breece Hall. Great matchup for Breece Hall, by the way. That game's going to be a lot of fun between the Jets and the Bills. Small sample, week 1, but Derrick Henry led the league in outside zone runs last week against the Bills. And on outside zone runs, the Ravens rushed for 12 carries, 136 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Second in the league last week in outside zone runs was Breece Hall, who gets the Bills this week. Not to mention all the hype about another running back working in with Breece Hall was pretty much farce, as we suggested it could be last week together. So love Breece Hall this week against Buffalo. Pick one rest of season for PPR, just one. Jalen Waddle, Quentin Johnson, or Cedric Tillman. And I'm going to say Jalen Waddle, with the caveat that Tyreek Hill could be traded, and we are not writing off the Dolphins just yet. Should we write off the Dolphins? Probably. But we're not doing it just yet, because this Patriots defense without Christian Gonzalez, all-star cornerback Christian Gonzalez, who is out once again in week 2, just allowed Geno Smith to have a career-high 9 passes that gained 20 yards. That means it could be Tua's turn. Will it be Tua's turn? From what we've seen, probably not. But again, this goes back to making sure it is my job to be your therapist, basically. My therapist here is all about this. But I am your therapist in being the one who doesn't overreact. Who doesn't say, like, Harold Fannon's better than Brock Bowers. I'm not going to ever say that. I'm trying to come up with reasonable outcomes, to be a reasonable individual that still remembers we had 6 months of research and processing, not just one game to overreact to. So I still think Waddle, and then Cedric Tillman and Quentin Johnson. Cedric Tillman, by the way, who has now outscored Jerry Jeudy in 4 of their last 5 full games together. Like, Cedric Tillman should be ranked ahead of Jerry Jeudy, just to let you know. Rankings are not going to show that, but he should be. Because, as we talked about last week, it was looking like Cedric Tillman at least had an outcome, a range of outcomes, that he was the better player. So far, all he does is be the better receiver than Jerry Jeudy. Brian Arias asks, Mike Evans, T. Higgins, George Pickens, Ricky Pearsall. It goes back to me, since he has to sit one quite easily, George Pickens. Pickens behind Evans, T. Higgins, Pearsall, quite easily, given the volume those other two receive. Joe Burrow, 7 yards in the fourth quarter. And we talked about how the Bengals have historically been a terrible offense in week 1. And the fact that the Browns have also defended Joe Burrow well in the past couple of years under Jim Schwartz. So it's not shocking to see that the Bengals offense fumbled as a whole, just stumbled. And this is going to be my last one for the afternoon before we get out of here. And that is, as John Erhard. No, that one's too easy because you'd play Devonta Smith over George Pickens and Jalen Waddle. Let's get to a tough one that teaches all one. Teaches us all. Drake May over Caleb Williams, by the way, quite easily. Just look at what Daniel Jones did to the Dolphins defense last week. Now copy paste that onto Drake May. That simple. Daniel Jones' legs, excluding anything he did through the air, Daniel Jones' lower body was the QB 17 on the week last week. Again, copy paste that to Drake May as a top 12 quarterback in week 2. Let's get to Keon Coleman, Travis Hunter, Calvin Ridley, Jameson Williams. Pick one. And that is still, because we have not talked about Calvin Ridley and his team high 32% target share. But Cam Ward also went 1 of 12 on throws 10 yards downfield. Was that the Broncos defense, or was that Cam Ward struggling to get downfield, which is not good since Calvin Ridley led the Titans in depth of target? I don't know. But because of that, I would rather take a shot on Jameson Williams, who ran a route on every dropback for the Lions. And unlike last week, when we knew the Packers defense with Micah Parsons was going to pressure the hell out of Jared Goff, the Bears only pressured J.J. McCarthy on 22% of his dropbacks, 30th in the league. We think Jared Goff's going to get some time. And although we have mighty question marks for the Lions offense and their concepts from week 1, at least we think Jared Goff's going to work from a clean pocket. And then perhaps that leads to Jameson Williams getting the ball downfield. You can follow me at @NotJDaigle on Twitter. And of course, I will be back at Establish the Run midweek next week in podcast form, wherever you listen. Also, of course, week 3 Friday Q&A, 4 p.m. Eastern. 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Eastern next week. Until then, good luck this week and be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.